On the eve of a polarizing and contentious election, you probably have some enemies. In his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus called us to love our enemies, but to do so, we have to acknowledge that we have an enemy. Only then can we grapple with their actions, invite them to lay down their animosity, and open a path for healing, reconciliation, and unity. Join Sycamore Creek for this 5-week series to learn from Jesus how to have an enemy.
In Leviticus, an Old Testament book of the Bible, it says, "Whoever takes a human life shall surely be put to death. Whoever takes an animal life shall make it good life for life. If anyone injures his neighbor, as he has done it shall be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, whatever injury he has given a person shall be given to him." Now there are lots of parts of the Old Testament that I wrestle with, and in my better moments, I wrestle with these verses too. It's not that I'm regularly going around killing people or animals, I hope, but in my worst moments, I take these verses and I think, revenge, sweet revenge. You cut me off while I'm driving? Well, I'm going to accelerate around you and I'm going to cut you off. Fracture for fracture. It's biblical. Now, you snag the next place in line at the grocery store with your 47 items in the self-checkout. Well, I'm going faster next time and I have 47 items now too. Eye for an eye. It's biblical. You're saying swear words and anger toward me? Well, guess what? I have some creative language that I'd like to share with you too. Tooth for a tooth. It's biblical. And when it comes to enemies, like real enemies, there's a part of me that wants them to get what I feel they deserve. Whatever injury they have given to me, I want to give it back to them. Maybe you felt that way too at times. By the way, those verses in Leviticus are about not escalating harm. They're about proportionate responses. And you'll notice my responses were proportional. They're biblical. And then Jesus talks about those verses in Leviticus in his Sermon on the Mount. And he says to me and to all of his followers, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, give your coat as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to the one who asks of you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you." That's a little different than what I was thinking about when I'm in the checkout line or driving my car or listening to someone swear at me. Today we're going to talk again about what Jesus says to us about enemies. Because as followers of Jesus, we don't resolve enmity, and again, that's having enemies, by destroying our enemies. We don't just get rid of enemies. Jesus ushered in a different system, a new way of living that changes the order of power itself. And this is called the reign of God. But before we get to that, let's reflect a moment on how challenging this is going to be for us, not just with enemies, but with the people who annoy us or inconvenience us or delay us. These people aren't even enemies, and we still struggle to respond to them well. I gave examples of shopping and driving and dealing with someone's angry swearing. Here's our first question for discussion. What actions of others tempt you to lash out in response? Let's take a moment and let's talk about that. Today we're continuing in our series, How to Have an Enemy. Now, this series is based on a book of that name by Melissa Florer-Bixler. Melissa Florer-Bixler is a writer and pastor who lives in Raleigh, North Carolina. And this content will challenge us around the command of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount to love our enemies. She notes, Jesus does not call us to claim we no longer have enemies. Instead, he shows us how to have enemies well. Now, here's a definition of enemy that I adapted from Melissa Florer-Bixler. An enemy is a person who uses their power actively or passively to harm or dominate another. This is Jesus' call to his followers, to love in such a way where we extend an invitation to form a life that no longer exercises the self-destruction of hatred, of loathing, and of violence toward our enemies. We love our enemies when we recognize that their harm of us hurts them too. We love our enemies when we create a world together that releases both of us and our enemy, from the impacts of harm. We love our enemies as part of the family of God, the children of God. And what we'll find is that loving our enemies well is part of living into the reign of God. Now, Jesus was born and lived in first century Palestine. He was a Jewish person, fully human, who was formed within a long and terrible history of occupation in Judea. And Jesus inherited the constant threat of annihilation of the Jewish people that still persists today. And to the people of that era and to us today, Jesus issued this challenge about enemies in the Sermon on the Mount. You've heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. In Luke's gospel, there's a similar teaching of Jesus called the Sermon on the Plain. And in that teaching, Jesus says, but I say to you who are listening, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. These teachings of Jesus fit together very well, and they envision the new reign of God brought near. And this teaching has been greatly misused by people in power. Love your enemies. Jesus is quoted as saying this in both Matthew and in Luke. And the difficulty for us, just like me choosing to use those passages in Leviticus to justify my frustration, is the harm that love your enemies can do if misused. Love your enemies has been misused as a cudgel to suppress movement work for the liberation and for the freedom of individuals to escape harmful situations. Love your enemies has been misused and deployed to hold women captive to intimate partner violence abuse and to prevent people from reporting sexual assault in the church. Love your enemies has been weaponized against vulnerable communities who attempt to pull themselves out from under the heel of oppressive power. To give a specific example, phrases like love your enemies and forgive and bless those who curse you have been another form of oppression for the Black people in the United States, groaning under the weight of systemic and individual racism. James Cone, one of the founders of the Black liberation theology movement, has often been questioned by white people about the methods of Black liberation. He's often asked about whether he'd encourage Black Christians to turn the other cheek and go the extra mile. And he notes, well, these are favorite white questions. And it's significant that they're almost always addressed to the oppressed and never to the oppressors. As we wade today into loving our enemies, it's helpful, I would say even essential, for us to be aware of the ways we all too quickly twist Jesus' words to suit whatever agenda we already have that we want to accomplish. We're all selfish, and the challenge of Jesus' words is to apply them to everyone, including ourselves. White people, according to Cone, only become concerned when violence is enacted upon them. There's an inherent hypocrisy in that position. But what Cone rightly notes is that for many people on the underside of power, the command to love one's enemy is not a source of freedom, it's another form of oppression. Here's the thing. Loving enemies is going to require some unpacking for us to do well. Let's not make loving enemies a form of oppression. Let's make this a source of freedom for everyone. And what we'll find today is that Jesus' teaching to love our enemy results in the upheaval of the catastrophic forms of race and class and power that we are all entangled in. But we don't need new oppressors. We don't need new wealth. We don't need new social classes. We need a new world. We need the reign of God. Now, before we get to this reign of God, let's pause a moment to reflect on the caution we need to have around Jesus' teaching to love your enemy. Now, I've given you some examples, and I want you to reflect and imagine for a moment. Here's our next question for discussion. Imagine or observe together how Jesus' teaching to love your enemy could possibly be misused. Let's take a moment and let's talk about that. When Jesus addressed his followers and told them in Matthew and in Luke to love your enemies, he He was talking to the poorest and most vulnerable people in the ancient world. He spoke to tenant farmers and to fishermen and to widows and to beggars. And he spoke to those peasants who built the Roman Empire with backs broken by oppression. And under the heat of political repression and economic terror, Jesus tells them to bless and not curse their enemies. Now, what does Jesus mean when directing these words to the poorest and most vulnerable in the ancient world? Well, Jesus came to a people and asked them to follow him, to embody God's reign, to remove themselves from the hierarchies of power and the systems of destruction. There's a new ordering of creation that we're invited into where the distinction between friend and enemy collapses. Jesus is the gospel. And the work of the gospel uncovers the source of our enmity. Again, that's having an enemy. And the gospel invites us to stand fully before that enmity, to confront it, and to be transformed. It's liberation, it's freedom, it's the reign of God where enemies are freed from enacting harm and victims are freed from receiving it. And love your enemies is much more than just an ethical injunction. This isn't a new set of rules designed to shift our behavior in a certain direction. Loving our enemies is transformation that breaks open a new world order. And it's only through transformation that we can love our enemy as we proclaim that terror no longer has any power over us. Loving our enemies is about finding a better way forward for everyone. And in the real world that we live and move in, this is tough stuff to live out. So let's explore a practical example of what loving enemies might look like. Melissa Flora-Bixer notes in a somewhat confusing statement. She says, we cannot love our enemies and defend those who are vulnerable. And so when times are difficult, we must choose. Now, let me unpack what I think Melissa Flora-Bixer is saying here. Loving our enemies does not mean allowing harm to continue. Loving our enemies means that we try to stop their harm. And in the midst of that work, it's really hard to do both these things, love our enemies and defend the vulnerable. You see, to love our enemies involves defending the vulnerable and stopping harm. That's active, difficult work to lovingly resist harm. Now, this proved true for the famous German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer spent much of his early career in Germany before World War II pondering the theme of love your enemies from Jesus. In his early writing, he concluded Christ died for all, murderer and murdered, victim and perpetrator. That's Bonhoeffer's original language, but by 1942, and you know that's right in the war, almost all the language around loving your enemies had dropped from Bonhoeffer's writing and teaching. It's a really interesting shift. And this shift for Bonhoeffer can be traced to two events. First, the first event is Kristallnacht, where the Third Reich shifted to full-scale repression of the Jewish people in Germany. And it was not just the acts themselves of what the Third Reich was doing to the Jewish people. It was the silence of the moderate clergy, Christians, who looked on and said and did nothing. Now, maybe the clergy thought they were loving their enemies well by doing and saying nothing, but Bonhoeffer found that they utterly failed to love their enemies well in their failure to defend the Jewish people. Bonhoeffer noted through Kristallnacht that loving enemies well was defending the vulnerable. The second event for Bonhoeffer was a brief visit to the United States where he considered fleeing to escape from Germany. And shortly after that visit, Bonhoeffer became part of the German resistance movement. Again, as Melissa Flora-Bixer noted, we cannot love our enemies and defend those who are vulnerable, and so when times are difficult, we must choose. Bonhoeffer chose the ethical practicality of standing against the death and destruction of the vulnerable. He loved his enemies well by defending the vulnerable. And Bonhoeffer saw what the Nazi regime was doing, and he couldn't stand by and do nothing. He couldn't flee to America. Concern for his neighbor displaced abstract moralism and rules. You see, humility, suffering, forgiveness, and love of our enemies, these are not abstract ideas. They're concrete and they're embodied in the person of Jesus Christ. To love our enemies is to be responsible for others and to resist the destruction of our neighbors. Bonhoeffer can help us move beyond the tension of idealism and toward practicality in Jesus' instruction to love our enemies. I mentioned earlier that a visit to the United States changed Bonhoeffer's perspective. He went to visit the US and he was trying to decide whether he should flee from the harm in Germany. And he reflected on that US visit later when he was back in Germany in a letter he wrote. He said, "I have come to the conclusion that I made a mistake in coming to America. I must live through this difficult period of our national history with the Christian people of Germany." Bonhoeffer realized the importance of his being with the people of Germany. He couldn't flee. He needed to be with the people who were suffering from enemies. Bonhoeffer realized that he'd have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if he didn't share the trials of the people in the war with those people. And here's the thing about loving our enemies. It's a call to build love in the midst of destruction. To follow Jesus, we live out a new imagination, a different way of living. And well, Jesus willed human life into being through love. And Jesus died on the cross in order to reorder creation toward that love. Yet we continually lose the thread of loving others, especially our enemies. Let's think through what this might look like to love our enemies in the midst of the situations we currently face in our lives and in our country. I know for me, part of loving my neighbors has been speaking up when I see potentially harmful situations. One example of this, my wife Jana and I will sometimes see or hear pretty intense arguments while we're out on our nightly walks. And we love our enemy by not just walking by and politely ignoring the conflict, but instead we stop. We ask if everything is okay, and we patiently make sure that whoever the most vulnerable person is in that argument doesn't need our support. That's a small example, and I'm sure you can think of even bigger ones. Here's our next and final question for discussion. Reflect on your own life and the situations that you face in our community and our country. What can you do to love your enemy by resisting the harm and or destruction of your neighbors? Let's talk about that. Loving our enemies is not about absorbing destruction without protest. Loving our enemies is not a distraction from terrible working or living conditions. Loving our enemies is not just a comfort with discomfort and with abuse. As Flora Bixer tells us, Jesus does not call us to enemy love for the purpose of making miserable people content in their misery. Enemy love, loving our enemies, is way more than this. And enemy love tears apart broken systems and it rebuilds and reimagines a world order where our lives are based on liberating love. This is very different than fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Loving our enemies is reimagining a new world of liberating love. And in order to do that, it's going to require new tools. All too often, to bring about change, we try to use the tools of hierarchy and different isms for advancement. All too often, we use violence and coercion to force liberation. And to love our enemies requires us to creatively find new ways to love because the way we get to something better matters. We can't use the same old tools and expect transformed lives and transformed systems. As an example, at one point, white feminists in the United States used the tools of patriarchy and racism for social advancement. They appealed to men and to the systems of power that advantage men to get white women the right to vote. They also played upon the racism in our country to get white women the right to vote. Now they got the right to vote, but they didn't advocate for all women. It was a right they sought for white women only, and that's not genuine change. That's not transformation. That's utilizing the tools of oppression to free yourself while continuing to oppress and suppress others. That's not loving your enemies. Followers of Jesus are called to put down the old ways of building and consolidated power. Followers of Jesus are called out of their enmity and into a new social order that eliminates the destruction in which enemies are embedded. Let me give you an example of this from Jesus. In both Luke's Sermon on the Plain and in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives an ordinary experience in his day for common people to subvert the current social order that maintains structures of oppression. So the people of Jesus' day groaned under the weight of Roman oppression. And so Jesus gives them instructions for people who are oppressed by a particularly powerful group, the Roman garrison. The Roman garrison had the power to force others into service as porters and to steal their clothes without consequence. For people oppressed by this system, there was no exit and there was no recourse. And yet Jesus offered a way to protest. Jesus offered a way to not be worn down and overwhelmed and broken. He offered new tools. Jesus said, "But I say to you who are listening, love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes your coat, do not withhold even your shirt." Jesus called the oppressed Jewish people to give up their clothes. Jesus called the oppressed Jewish people to carry the pack of a soldier an extra mile. This is loving your enemy. And again, it's a real enemy by resisting their harm using new tools. In an act of resistance that de-escalates, Jesus invites his followers to turn the other cheek when slapped by the Roman garrison. Now, those slaps from Roman soldiers, they're not meant to garner a response other than submission. They were designed to be the end of the story. But to turn the other cheek was to refuse the destructive power that's also destroying your enemy. It's an act of resistance. It's an act of loving your enemy. It's a way of signaling without escalating or without using violence that what the other person is doing is not okay. Now, the turning the other cheek, that may have been Jesus using hyperbole. Maybe it's not literal. But it's a sign, it's a signal to resistance that is not violent. We don't accept violence. We actively resist in a way that loves and de-escalates. So in a system of intimidation and oppression, Jesus refused the terms. Loving an enemy is not about sentimentality or emotional manipulation. It's about ushering in the reign of God against principalities and powers, and it is active, and it's imaginative, it's powerful, it's real strength, and it's real love. Loving an enemy is disconcerting. It can even be frightening to our enemies. As Gandhi, who worked to put loving your enemies into practice, notes, it requires courage and imagination. It is essentially that decision not to be passive, not to be the victim, but equally not to avoid passivity by simply reproducing what's been done to you. Loving our enemies is not passive. It's not accepting what is done to us. It's love and it's active. It's tough. It's a quest. It is daring and it involves growth. Loving our enemies means that those who would oppress us will not have the final word because they did not define who we are. I want to invite us today to dig our roots down deep into God's love for us. All too often, we are God's enemies in the ways that we act, in the ways that we turn our back on God's love, and yet God reaches out to us again and again in love. May we find a deep identity in God as God's beloved, and from that identity, may we then go and love our enemies. Jesus says, love your enemies. Resisting my desire for retribution in the car or in the self-checkout line or when someone is swearing at me, well, that's working to usher in the reign of God, a new world. And I have work to do on loving my enemies. And maybe you do too. Maybe we respond to our enemies not with harm for harm, not with violence for violence, not with abuse for abuse, not with intimidation for intimidation, but with love. May we offer a love that does not accept harm. May we offer a love that is not passive. May we offer our enemies a love that is resistance to their harm. A resistance to the harm that enemies do to us and a resistance from harming them back to get more power. And as we work together to have enemies well, I want to invite you to join the resistance that Jesus taught. Love your enemies. Amen.